Professor Howard Williams takes you on a journey through time and space, exploring death and memory, past and present. Archaeodeath.
Cup of tea? Don't mind if I do. Skull cut with stout? Don't mind if I do. Right. So, the end of Roman Britain, one of the great foci of debate in British archaeology and Northwest European archaeology is what happens to societies during and after the fragmentation and collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And for Roman Britain, as a province that maintains itself into the middle of the 4th century and declines in socio-economic and military coherence during the later 4th and into the early mid-5th centuries, we have to face the challenge of working out how to interpret the fragmentary evidence of when everything starts to get more difficult to see. Because with the breakdown of coin minting and coin circulation, the diagnostically easily datable pottery forms, and the abandonment of clearly diagnostic settlement forms, including in the countryside villas and in the towns, obviously the towns, we start to see it's much more difficult to interpret what happens next, or what sequence of events happens next. And therefore, ongoing research from a range of strands, looking at the landscape itself, looking at settlement sites, looking at burials, looking at faunal evidence, macrofossils, and a host of other dimensions, makes it, is helping to build a picture into what is often called the Dark Ages, the 5th and 6th centuries in particular, where we have a plateau in the radiocarbon dating, making it very difficult to have precision radiocarbon dates, and we lack that easily datable evidence, easily sequences of artifacts and materials and that we can readily identify. So this is an ongoing challenge, and you'd think that we would have sussed this a couple of generations ago in archaeology, but the 5th century in particular, and the 5th and 6th centuries more broadly, are a focus of ongoing contentious debate and different models for understanding the timing, character and extent of the breakdown of Roman Britain is a focus of heated debate, with some scholars seeing a rapid breakdown of the Roman province and a 5th, 6th century sort of dark age of fragmentation before kingdoms emerge in the 7th and 8th centuries. Others seeing a continuation of late antique practices, contacts and connections with the Mediterranean world and Western Europe persisting, particularly in Western Britain. And then others seeing a sort of rather than a picture of rapid collapse and then slow build up, others seeing a slow decline and then a collapse. Others see a sort of transformation that's ongoing in a series of sequences of events. And the written sources for this period are notoriously poor, and so we are often left with an archaeological narrative. And in that context, I wanted to look at a brand new publication in the Archaeological Journal. It's the publication of the Royal Archaeological Institute, called Shakenoak Revisited, Post-Roman Occupation and Burial at the Codswold Edge Villa in the Light of New Evidence and Approaches. And this is by a really rich interdisciplinary team of archaeologists and historians. The authors are John Blair, John Hines, two of the biggest names in early medieval history and archaeology, Catherine Tate, Richard Madgwick, with contributions by Morton Anderson, Katie E. Fallis, Angela L. Lamb and Alexandra J. Nedenbracht. And this paper looks at the Roman villa known as Shakenoak. And Shakenoak's really interesting because it sits really on in a pivotal transition zone in the fate of different parts of Roman Britain. So I'll read the abstract and that will give you a context. Shakenoak Villa, Oxfordshire, is situated at the interface of the sub-Roman Cotswold with the early Anglo-Saxon Upper Thames region. A probable sacred site, it may have been an enduring ritual focus. Place names and topographical evidence builds an unusually strong impression of continuity across the post-Roman period. As with other Cotswold villas, some buildings were occupied well into the 5th century, and a cemetery of at least 22 inhumations, mainly male and with sharp weapon trauma, provides radiocarbon dates which, when modelled, centre around the middle to second half of the 5th century. So multiple isotope analysis, that's carbon, nitrogen, strontium, sulfur and oxygen, if I've got that right, and calcium carbonate of 7 different individuals indicates a Northern European diet typical of the period and suggests that most of the individuals came from southwest Britain. They may therefore have been warriors posted here by a post-Roman authority in the Cotswolds, not Germanic-speaking mercenaries from the continent. The late and sub-Roman military equipment and the 5th century bow brooch are reassessed in the light of more recent studies and new parallels. A boundary ditch contained redeposited Anglo-Saxon material of the 5th to 8th century range, suggesting an adjacent settlement. 8th century shatters, that's silver coins, were found in the villa itself. With the new perspectives, Shakenoak re-emerges as a classic study in continuity. So what they're trying to say is that this excavated site that was first excavated from 1960 to 1967, published in the late 1970s, has been mentioned in the 70s and early 80s as a case study of potential continuity of late occupation in villas and then subsequent slow decline. But in the 1980s and 1990s, they say that the villa fell from discussion. It just didn't get discussed much. And they're trying to pick up the pieces and put it into a new context. And what we're trying to... The real new results, so this is working with old data, and their new approaches are to evaluate the site afresh from a number of different dimensions. So here's the publication: Shakenoak Revisited, Post-Roman Occupation and Burial at the Cotswold Edge Villa in the Light of New Evidence and Approaches. And there's the abstract I just read to you. What they're trying to do is to look at it firstly in a landscape context. So this is the site of the villa, next to an offshoot of the Evenlode River. There's Oxford's about there, but that wasn't important in the Roman period. You've got the Roman site of Frilford, Dorchester upon Thames, Alchester and Akeman Street, which comes from London originally, and is heading for Cirencester. So this gives you, and here you can see the Windrush Valley, the Evenlode Valley, and the Cherwell, all tributaries of the Thames. So this is the Upper Thames Valley. For those of you who don't know central England, that's not very helpful. This is the Cotswold Ridge up here with Chedworth Roman Villa, which has recently produced radiocarbon dating from its mosaics, suggesting repairs of the mosaics well into the 5th century. And so these are some of the other villa sites of the Cotswold Ridge, including Barnsley Park, Horton Quarry. These sites are part of a distribution of villas with evidence of late occupation into the 5th century. If we look more closely down at the local map, you can see it's in a tight series of combes of small little streams. It's a very odd location for a villa, and they make the point that maybe this was a numinous place, a ritual place, because the villa is actually a not very nice place to build a structure. And in fact, many of these villas seem to be associated with springs. And this may be to make sure it had a plentiful water source, but also it may have been because these were sacred places if not in the Iron Age, and certainly in the Roman period. And many of these villas are in very difficult places to build, involving a lot of terracing, but they may have been being built there because of an aesthetic and a sacred association with water. And they make the argument that this place would have been perhaps a really significant distinctive location, and that may have defined why it survives in the landscape. And there's a Bronze Age barrow just here that may have been a very significant feature overlooking the villa, and therefore maybe that was a persistent prominent landmark that still has significance thousands of years after its creation. Right, so that's the broader context, and it's near to a Roman road, and it's integrated into the broader Romano-British landscape. And another feature that's interesting is it's actually built within the area of the pre-Roman Iron Age Grimsditch linear earthwork complex. But anyway, we won't go into all of that. But they sort of make a case that this was a special place and therefore may have continued to be in importance over time. So if I can just... So here you can see the villa complex, and this was at the excavations in the 1960s, and you can see a number of different buildings around a stream which has the name of Yeken, which we'll come back to, the Yeken stream. And there's the Bronze Age burial mound. And then when we zoom in, you can see across each side of the stream there are buildings on both sides, opposing sides of the stream. So on the north side you have building B, and on the south side you have building A, and then there's a building C here. And I suppose what's really, if I can just zoom in a little further so you can get a sense of it, what's really interesting here is you've got a structure that is to the north of the stream, which seems to have late surviving evidence into the 5th century in the western end. So most of the building range is decayed, but the western end survives. And then you've got evidence of building B down here. Most of it declined into unroofed ruins with a layer of black earth overlaying it, so the decay of the building sometime in the early 5th century. But it's possible that one building at the end remained used and inhabited. And these little lines here, these are all the burials they found. And these are all inhumation burials, 22 in total. All but one osteologically sexist male, although they seem to have lost most of the human remains since, and a number of them showing evidence of sharp force trauma. In other words, they were killed in close quarter combat. So this is really interesting. Okay, let's just pull it out a bit here. So we've got evidence of a Roman villa, partially excavated in the 1960s, with evidence of late surviving occupation and with burials. And the first bit is they look at the broader environs and landscape context, and then they make the argument that actually there's a number of strands of evidence that suggest there's something really interesting going on at Shakenoak. And they say that the Brittonic stream name Yeken is a rare survival of a small river course with a British name. Mostly in southern and eastern Britain, only the big rivers survive with Brythonic names, the Welsh names, if you like, the old Welsh names, the names of people who lived in the area during the time of the Roman occupation and still spoke Brythonic languages, part of the Celtic language group, right? So the stream here is called the Yeken, and they argue that name it's really weird to have a surviving small stream without an old English name. Because from the late 5th, 6th and 7th centuries, this area became not necessarily completely occupied by English speakers, old English speakers, but the people who are defining the place names are Old English, and that's what survives. And by 1066, all right the way up, the charters from the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, most place names, most habitative names and feature names are in Old English. So this is a rare survival. So that's a hint. Also, it's not far from a Wickham place name, which is recorded in 969. And that's often associated with places where Old English speakers came across the ruins of Roman buildings. And that's an interesting feature. They also make the point that the parish of Wilcote is the smallest in Oxfordshire and one of the smallest in the country. And they even speculate, or they don't say, we're not going to say it, but we're almost going to say it, could this actually be a rare survival of a Roman estate? Because the north of the estate is on Akeman Street, the south of the estate is on another Roman road, and you've got the villa complex. So actually this fits into the Roman landscape very well. And so they're saying, could this in part be a rare fragment of a surviving estate from the Roman period through? You've also got evidence of a Middle Anglo-Saxon activity. So by the 650s, 660s, this landscape's being reoccupied with intensive occupying as the economy booms again. And there's also a place name recorded in the charter bounds of 1044 for Witney, where near the villa, called Where the Cnitus Lie, which is like where the lads are buried. And this was very interesting in relation to the burials, because people thought, well, maybe these are the lads, these are the boys that were buried. Now we don't know for sure, but it's odd that wasn't recorded in an earlier charter of 969. But there is a hint that there's something special about this place, that people are burying people who are famed and remembered. So that's a really interesting feature, which could relate to the burials or might not. So we've got this kind of fragmentary picture suggesting something's going on at Shakenoak that's different. And there's a surviving hints of a of something going on, a Roman survival. And they take this forward and they look at the burials again. So this is building B, and they're suggesting that that top room may have still been occupied into the 5th century. And these burials, only one of them has surviving in a plan, burial 16, but all the little lines are inhumation burials. And all of these burials are, as I said, bar one, are male. And when they've reanalyzed them, the radiocarbon dates were thought, came out very clearly centred on the middle and late 5th century into the 6th century. So this is the Bayesian, this is the chronological models for the radiocarbon dates of the burials. So 405, 475, 480, 500, 373. So, radiocarbon date doesn't give us a date of, like a dendro date of which year the person died, but it gives us a range, okay? And this is really striking. They also did multiple isotope and trauma analysis. So the isotope analysis looked at the geology and put the burials into context of that geology, and they make the argument that the most likely source for these individuals in life, where they grew up, was coastal southwest Britain. So Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, Somerset. So these individuals who are being buried on the edge of the Cotswolds may have been males who grew up to the west in British territory. The trauma evidence of the 23 inhumations they had, I said 22, I meant 23, they were able to evaluate 10, and they all had blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma on their skulls. So here's some examples. Sorry I should have done a content warning if you don't like your human remains, but here is one of the skulls, right? So you got the parietal, temporal, and occipital skeleton of 443 with arrows indicating each of the trauma wounds. So they've got various trauma wounds there, and sharp force trauma. You can see that. Maybe I need to make that a bit bigger, but you can see there where they put the line. You've got if I can just mark it out to you. So that is the line on the skull, and they've just marked it above so you can see where it goes. So someone's been bashed over the head. That may not have been a killing blow, but that would have hurt like a bastard, to use a phrase. Hurt like hell on a jet ski, John. And here, a really nice one if you're into your trauma. There it is. So we're so used to hearing the word trauma used to refer to mental torture and upset, but of course the word trauma comes from someone's been hit over the side of the head. Look at that. Bam. Look at that cut. It's unlikely you're going to survive that, really. You could, but these are perimortem, no evidence of healing. Okay, so these people didn't get up again. That's the point. And 10 out of 23 is a sizable portion, and that suggests a very distinct, a violent time and a very distinctive death. And also we've got some really interesting bits of fragments of metalwork from the villa site, which they re-evaluate as parts of late and sub-Roman belt fittings. So whoever was living here, the villa population was surviving into the 5th century, and there's some very distinctive buckles that we can find across southwest Britain and also the rest of Britain in the 4th century, and also northwest Europe, Belgium, places like this we have. And this is a small long brooch, which is a distinctively Anglo-Saxon object, but here associated with a sort of sub-Roman phase where there's very little Germanic influence apart from this brooch. So that's kind of out of place, but it's interesting. So we do have a really interesting assemblage. And the conclusion from this paper is that what we're looking at is a site that's on the edge of things. It's a time of change, a time of transformation, where Anglo-Saxons are coming into eastern Britain, settling not far away around Dorchester upon Thames, Fairford, Lechlade on the main Thames, but just on the edge of this area there's a Roman villa that at least in part is continuing for a while, with warriors, perhaps males. I mean, I don't know, they die violent deaths, so whether they were very good at being warriors is another question, but individuals living here, many of who die violent deaths in the 5th century. And there's parallels of other villas in the area with surviving late features, and this fits a pattern of a sub-Roman phase of southwest Britain of inhumation burials. So they're arguing for what we're looking at here is a really rare case of late antique continuity and an engaged conservatism of practice just before the area becomes absorbed into a culturally, linguistic and politically Anglo-Saxon world. Okay, so that's really interesting. So what do I think about this? Let me bring it back to me. So this is an interesting new paper that's going over old data, but applying new radiocarbon dates, new analysis of the metalwork, new analysis of the landscape, and in particular the dating and analysis of the trauma on the skeleton. So it's a really interesting case study, and it actually tells a very sort of, I'm just trying to, Jesus, why does everything have to get in the way when you're trying to organise your money funstering tripods, which is a technical term. Yeah, hopefully that will stay in place. Okay, there you are. Okay, let me just have another sip from my my skull goblet of doom. There you are. We need a name for him. If Colin is the skeleton from work, I don't know. I think this could be a dune. It looks like a dune, doesn't it? My dog barks at the sound of your mouse wheel. Oh, it has a little squeak, doesn't it? Yeah. Roar, roar. Okay. Hi, Flakes and Bones. Okay, so this is a really interesting site, but it's very frustrating and fragmentary. It's a really badly written paper. It's a really poorly, but not badly written. It's very opaquely written paper, I would say, and I found it very frustrating. It's got some very eminent scholars involved with it, but it's a bit of a dog's breakfast in terms of cohering as a narrative. It's almost like they've gone out of their way to make it as difficult to read as possible, and I think that's worth. That is a criticism I think we should be noted. It's a very fragmentary picture. We've got evidence of a very unusual type of cemetery with a lot of violence in it, of mainly males, and we don't have a direct parallel for that. East-west findless inhumation burial following the late Roman tradition does seem to continue in southwest Britain, and this fits that pattern. But I just wonder whether they're trying to see this too much in terms of an ethnic divide. This isn't like the Anglo-Saxon furnished cremation and inhumation graves only 20-25 miles away. Some of them only Minster level as a female burial from the 6th century, only 6 miles away. So this is distinctive, but I wonder whether this has to be seen in terms of southwest Britain. Because, this is a local area where there may have been very distinctive things going on. And I don't see why we need to, see it purely in terms of an ethnic divide between Britons and Saxons. There may have been a whole host of communities doing very different things in this area. And for example, I mean, you could make an argument these are Germanic warriors because it's a frontier zone. And where you say, well, the main thing is, the thing that really irked me is the stable isotope analysis, because a lot of studies are using stable isotope analysis and multi-isotope analysis to try and work out where people grew up and then identify where they've moved around. And I was trying to get my head around the science of this, and I'm not 100% convinced. So what they end up saying is this, and I want to go into some detail. I want to sort of the last paragraph of the stable isotope section. They say none of the individuals have values that adhere to those provided by the plants from Shakenoak in either strontium or sulfur, and only one individual, the oldest in the dataset, had a strontium isotope ratio consistent with origins in the local region. Right, so they're all non-locals apart from one, though this is consistent with locations across vast swathes of Britain and mainland Europe and therefore undiagnostic. Right, so that person who looks local could equally be an immigrant. Okay, do you follow me so far? So they're all either immigrants or they most likely could be immigrants, right? The sulfur isotope value of 11.2% for this individual is higher than one would expect locally and strongly suggests he was not raised in the vicinity, even though this mid-ranging value was otherwise undiagnostic. The other 6 individuals have strontium isotope values ranging from 0.7103 to 0.7118. These values are consistent with Paleozoic lithologies and are relatively common in the British biosphere, especially in Western Britain, but with patches in the south and east also. Right, so they said, you know where this is going, as I've told you. This is going, they came from southwest Britain, but they've already admitted there's parts of southern and eastern Britain that fit this pattern too. This includes areas close by, under 20 kilometres away to the side, such as the Galt Formation around Wantage and Didcot. So that's really close. The 3 individuals have undiagnostic sulfur isotope analysis similar to 482, grave 17. The other three individuals have higher values strongly suggestive of coastal origins, most likely in the west, given the effect of prevailing winds on sulfur isotope values. But potential areas of origin include coastal regions of Wales, Cornwall, Devon and Somerset, with smaller pockets in northwest England. It is noteworthy that animal remains from Iron Age sites found in chalk in Hampshire have produced similar high values, suggesting that coastal origins cannot be defined with complete confidence. So they're saying they're most likely to be from the west and from the coast, but they've also got Iron Age animals from Hampshire with similar values. However, none of the individuals has strontium values consistent with chalk lithology, and therefore coastal origins are considered markedly more likely. Okay, let's follow that then. Coastal. Comparable sulfur value isotope values have been produced for medieval individuals from southwest Wales, southeast Wales and Anglesey. Continental origins, particularly from the western coastal locations, cannot be discounted for the individuals from this isotopic perspective. So they could be from continental Europe, from coastal areas as well, which is all of the areas associated with the Anglo-Saxon migrations. However, given the range of evidence presented in this paper, the post-Roman dates and the fact that the isotope values can be readily sourced in Britain, coastal southwest Britain is considered the most parsimonious interpretation of origins. Hang on. That's what we call circular argumentation, right? So what you're saying is, because we think they're from southwest Britain, it's best to interpret the isotope evidence that they're from southwest Britain, and then we're arguing that these individuals come from southwest Britain because the isotope evidence tells us so. I'm not dismissing the isotope evidence, but I think that then the paper jumping to say we have evidence of males from southwest Britain defending a villa to the last against the waves of incoming Saxons isn't really borne out when you read that detail. So anyway, my point is it's worth looking at, worth thinking about, because this is a site that's been well known but is now getting a new lease of interpretive life. But there's clearly a lot more to be done on it and other sites so that we can put it into a broader pattern.
Why not follow ArchaeoDeath? Subscribe now on YouTube.